sphere, individuals are free to do as they wish, to choose how they make their living, to choose what educational paths they take, to determine how they dress, to determine how many children they have. So the notion is, and the phrase that's used is, negative liberty. Your sphere of liberty, a sphere free from state intervention, is the private sphere. In the public sphere, good order is mandated by law. You have to follow the law in order for everyone to thrive. And then political scientists take that liberal base and they say, liberal societies respect the public-private distinction. Authoritarian societies do not. And if you look at some of the studies from shortly after World War II, in the height of the Cold War, political scientists added another category. It was not just liberal governments and authoritarian governments, there were also totalitarian governments. So authoritarian governments encroach some on the private sphere. Totalitarian governments don't respect the private sphere at all. They see every aspect of life as subject to their regulation and control. Okay. What feminist political scientists have documented through some very crafty studies is that contrary to liberal democratic governments' accounts of themselves, they do not respect the private sphere any more than do regimes they've labeled authoritarian, much less totalitarian. So let's go back to how gender opens up ways of understanding politics that mainstream approaches don't show. In most countries of the world, from the moment you are born, your sex is recorded on a birth certificate. A birth certificate that you are not allowed to change and that has massive constraining power on what you can do in systems that privilege men over women. So if you're a baby girl, and that's what's encoded on your birth certificate, all kinds of educational opportunity may be foreclosed, occupational opportunity may be foreclosed, political opportunities may be foreclosed. Driving licenses are codified by sex. Marriage licenses are codified by sex. Death certificates are codified by sex. Liberal democracies, the same as lots of other regimes, are invested in categorizing their populace by sex, and every country in the world has legislation that treats men and women differently. Even the United States, that constantly misrepresents itself as the bulwark of freedom, has thousands of laws that treat women differently than men. And the Supreme Court of the United States, when women have contested these laws, say, as long as legislatures have a rational basis for treating women differently than men, then it's not for the courts to intervene. So the state is literally regulating the private sphere. It tells you who you can marry and who you cannot, often on the basis of religion, often on the basis of race, often on the basis of nationality. In every country in the world up through, well through the mid-20th century, if a woman married a foreign national, she lost her citizenship. She lost her right to be a member of her nation of birth by marrying a foreign national. The law presupposed that a decision to marry, supposedly a private decision, was an act of treason if you're a woman. It was making yourself unfaithful to your country of birth. The same law did not apply to men. Men could marry foreign nationals. Nothing happened to them. So differential treatment. So some people say, oh, well, that was then, this is now, no such thing. But we take France, for example, and you all know France, like the United States, constantly embraces its revolutionary values and claims it is a regime promoting liberty. And they often claim, particularly under the Sarkozy regime, they were claiming all the time that they were promoting the liberty of women as well as men, only it was women outside of France whose liberty they were promoting, not French national women. So in 2005, and again in 2010, France legislation banning women from wearing a headscarf in any public place, in schools, in workplaces, on streets, in any public space. Now, if there's any decision that ought to be a private decision, how do you dress? How do you present yourself in public? That's pretty private. But we have cases, not only France, Turkey passed similar legislation banning the headscarf, literally not allowing women students who chose to wear the headscarf to complete their final exams, so that women who had done all of their studies and were ready to graduate were not allowed to sit exams if they wore their headscarves. One very brave woman challenged that law, took it all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and much to my astonishment, the European Court of Human Rights did not strike down the headscarf ban as an infringement of the right of the individual to make decisions about her own life. They upheld it, saying that the government decided this was necessary for good order, so it's necessary. So Europe, again, which positions itself as the embodiment of liberty and freedom and all good values, is enshrining control on women's behavior, women's dress, women's self-presentation, which is a constraint on women's liberty. And that's right now, in our own decade, in our lifetimes. Okay, so the politics of intimacy, state action to control the behavior, the self-presentation, the relationship formation of some people. Most states have all kinds of rules about family formation, when and under what conditions you can have children or adopt children, who is allowed, whether same-sex couples are allowed to marry, whether same-sex couples are allowed to adopt. So the idea that there's this perfect realm of freedom, negative liberty, private sphere, is a myth that mainstream political scientists just don't even question. But feminist political scientists, starting from women's lives, suggest there are dimensions of power here that absolutely have to be investigated if we're going to understand the full force of any state at any given time. Okay, another term that feminist political scientists pay a lot of attention to is called the politics of identity. And by that, I do not mean mobilizations by people of particular ethnicities or women or race in their own behalf. By politics of identity, what I mean is states using their power, literally, to control what some of their citizens can do in very particular ways. So when states pass laws that say same-sex couples are not allowed to have health insurance, are not allowed to marry, are not allowed to have the right to make healthcare decisions about each other, are not allowed to adopt children, the state is producing a fixed identity by using the law to regulate some citizens differently than others. When states regulate people on the basis of race or ethnicity or religion or sexual orientation or gender, treating some differently than others, they are actively creating hierarchies of power. So by politics of identity, what I mean is the study of the way states use the law to create hierarchies among citizens, even though the Constitution claims formal equality. All of the constitutions, virtually every constitution in the world says equal rights of all citizens, formal equality before the law. And yet, they pass all kinds of ordinances, laws, regulations that treat some people differently than others. So again, if you really want to understand how power is circulating, you have to pay some attention to this politics of identity, to what the state is doing to create these hierarchies, sustain them over time, protect them from change, because lots of the groups that are oppressed by these laws have mobilized in their own defense, but the power of the state is used to keep them down. So, politics of embodiment, politics of exclusion, politics of intimacy, politics of identity. These are all dimensions of state action that mainstream political science doesn't even touch, but that feminist political scientists have written wonderful things about. The last thing I want to mention before I stop is the theory of gendered institutions, because this is another area in which feminist political scientists have made huge, insightful analyses that just don't appear in mainstream studies. So most states describe themselves as neutral vessels for the well-being of the community. They pass laws that are supposedly in everyone's interest. They don't take sides. And even though almost every political system has a political party competition, so that there are some people who disagree with other people about what good order and the well-being of everyone entails, they claim that partisan politics is an outsider activity. The state is this neutral, rule of law, equal treatment organization. What feminist scholars have been investigating is that when you use gender as an analytic lens, one of the very first things you discover is that no existing state, not even the Nordic states, treat men and women the same way. The institutions themselves are gendered. They're organized according to the rhythms of men's lives. They're organized according to men's view of the world, and they distribute power in ways that advantage men. So we have lots of wonderful studies of how gender operates as a system of power in institutions. And I should also note that to elaborate the whole theory, you would look intersectionally at race and gender, because women aren't all of one thing. Women are different among each other on the basis of a whole host of structural forces. But for sake of time, I'll focus just on the gendering part. If you think about parliamentary action, most parliaments were organized to begin holding sessions at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and to continue holding debates until late in the evening. This precedent came out of British practice, where lots of members of parliament, all men, had professions that they practiced in the morning. They practiced their profession, and then they'd go off to the Parliament building at 2 o'clock. They didn't have children to take care of. They didn't have dinners to prepare. They could spend their evening hours whiling away the time with other parliamentarians. And that practice, through colonialism, got dispersed. So in South Africa, for instance, after the fall of apartheid, in the first parliament in which women gained 29% of the seats, first time in South African history that all of a sudden there was a critical mass of women, Parliament had always opened at 2, continued debate late in the night, and the women MPs said, "Are you crazy? We have kids, we have families, we have homes, we have meals to prepare, we have health care to deal with." So one of their very first transformations was to change the hours in which the institution operated. Now, we don't usually think about hours of operation in terms of, is this a man's schedule or a woman's schedule? But any woman who has young children knows that there are certain times of day when you're on call, when you need to be there for your kids. So simple things like, when does business get done, can be totally gendered. Another dimension of gendered institutions which feminists have investigated, again using the Parliament as a case in point, the practices of power plays on the floor of Parliament. And I don't know how the Georgian Parliament operates, but the Westminster model, they have one person who's speaking, and all the other people, whether the backbench of the party speaking or whether the opposition party, are allowed to shout out, catcall, insult, shout down. I mean, it's raucous and loud and unwieldy, and it's a super masculine, aggressive, kind of puerile adolescent boy type behavior. So how do women function when all of a sudden they're elected as members of parliament, and the first time they get up to give a speech, they have all these men shouting them down, but now with a gendered edge, because when it's a woman speaker, they start making sexual comments, they start whistling, they start doing the kind of street harassment you would experience if you walk by a construction site in lots of cities of the world. So you get not just verbal abuse, which is part and parcel of the game of parliamentary exchange, but you get a sexualizing of the women, and then a waiting to see how do the women respond. And if the women look upset, then they are told they don't understand how to play the game, they don't have what it takes, they don't have the right competitive edge. So it's used to marginalize. But what if you have a super tough woman who says, gives it back as good as she gets? Well, then they say, well, she's not feminine. She doesn't really, fulfill the role of a woman MP, which is supposed to be to represent half of the society. So no matter what the woman does, she gets a negative assessment where a man would not be judged on the same terms. So you get differential standards for assessing performance, and women are typically judged much more harshly than men. You also have in Parliament committee systems where with seniority you often work your way into positions of chair of a committee. We've had several really interesting studies done that demonstrate positional power, the power of a committee chair, cannot be used in the same way by women as men. That committee chairing requires people to abide by the norms established in the process. So they ask the chair to be recognized, they speak in sequence, they follow certain kinds of rules about first one party, then the other party. When a woman chairs a committee, the men refuse to abide by those rules. They challenge her positional power. They act much more ruthlessly. They don't respect her seniority. They try to undercut her power. So when we talk about gendered institutions, we're talking about these kinds of dynamics that affect what you can do in office, how you can do it, and what's been documented in case after case and country after country is that the institutions are very subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, coded to advantage men, not women. And the last example I'll give on that front is who does the hard work of trying to shape legislation to represent women's interests. When there are no women in Parliament, the men claim that they're perfectly qualified to represent women's interests. Anybody can represent men or women, they say. When women come in, the men often farm women's issues off on the women. Early childhood education, parental leave issues, reproductive rights issues, access to abortion, anti-discrimination, and more recently, quota legislation, policies designed to really protect women's interests and well-being. The men say, well, we're no longer interested in that, let the women do it. But then, if the women do all the work to draft the legislation, introduce the legislation, work the system of power to get it to the floor, their male colleagues sometimes sabotage them and vote against it. So it's not just that they don't do the work to produce the legislation, they don't even support it. So we have several studies from places like Argentina, France, the United States, that show that women legislators, women parliamentarians, have to work twice as hard as their male counterparts to be successful because the men put so many roadblocks in their way. So we think, okay, each time women break a new barrier, they gain office, that finally we now have an equal playing field. But what gendered institutions demonstrate is that the playing field is not equal. Women have to do more to succeed than their male counterparts. And that's just on the job. I'm sure you are all familiar with the research that shows that women do double duty. They do a full day at work and they do work at home. and then they often do a triple shift because they're doing community building. They're doing the kinds of behind-the-scenes work that makes a community flourish, that builds relationships, that take care of the needs of people. So what feminist political science helps us to see is that there are all kinds of dimensions of political life in institutions of power, outside institutions of power, that structure the world so it still advantages men, which is why, of course, feminist political scientists are actively arguing that it makes no sense to claim that we're in a post-feminist era. The notion of post-feminism suggests that all the challenges for equal treatment have been met, so we don't need feminism anymore. And what the scholarship suggests is that no matter what institution you investigate, whether it's an educational institution, political institution, medical institution, diplomatic institution, you will find all kinds of gendered practices that advantage men, disadvantage women, which means we absolutely need feminist activism to continue to fight for this struggle of equal opportunity, equality, liberty in the 21st century. So with that, I will stop and open up for questions or discussion. Anything else you might like to know? Yes, no?
No, you said.
I don't know, please.
Okay.
According to you, can gender equality be realized through equal treatment? Because I'm quite sensitive toward this issue because I come from Italy, and you know we are not the champion of gender equality and gender, let's say, protection, because I'm thinking about gender equality in terms of women protection. And I don't think that, I mean, I perceive a thin border between gender equality and positive discrimination, and I'd like to know your opinion about it.
Okay. That's a great question, absolutely great question. If you define gender equality just in terms of equal treatment, then the norm that's being invoked is a male norm, a norm that's premised on laws passed by men to serve men's needs. So some of the examples we have of what goes wrong if you only think about equal treatment comes in relation to pregnancy. Men don't get pregnant. Equal treatment means the state takes no notice of pregnancy. So a case from the US, it was a routine practice of employers to fire women if they became pregnant. So in the 1970s, a group of women, empowered by the idea of feminism, took this to court to sue, saying that this was, a form of sex discrimination, to be fired because you were having a child, a perfectly natural process. And the United States Supreme Court in 1978 said pregnancy discrimination is not discrimination against women. It's just discriminating between pregnant and non-pregnant persons. So they said it was fine. Employers could fire women because they were pregnant. So if you want equal treatment, that's equal treatment. But that's not good enough because it's just not good enough. And there was, as you can imagine, a huge outrage that the court made such a terrible decision. And Congress, it was the first major act of the Congressional Women's Caucus. So in the late 1970s, women from the Democratic Party and women from the Republican Party in the U.S. Congress decided that instead of just respecting party discipline, they would come together to talk about some kinds of policies that women needed. And the very first policy that they drafted was a law to prohibit discrimination on the basis of pregnancy. So one step for women. So now it is illegal to fire people when they become pregnant.
Yeah,
but
it is done.
It's still done. Oh,
yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. But the other half of your question was about hiring issues. So it was one thing to begin with firing. But the issue of positive discrimination, when you have two candidates who are in all respects equally qualified, because women are so underrepresented, you ought to give preference to the woman. That's illegal in the United States. It's not allowed by law. Britain was one of the countries that first championed positive discrimination. And we now have lots of studies to look at what happens when you use positive discrimination and when you don't. And even calling it positive discrimination assumes that the hiring processes are themselves fair, so that any man applying for a job and any woman applying for the job have equal chance at it. But what we know from a whole host of social psychology studies is that there's systemic bias in evaluating qualifications based on sex and race. So social psychologists have done studies where they'll take an identical CV, the same school, same grades, same outstanding achievements. They'll put a man's name on it, and they'll put a woman's name on it, and they'll circulate it to employers and ask them to rate it on a 10-point scale. How good is this candidate? The exact same CV with a man's name on it gets described as far better, far more qualified, far more talented than that CV with a woman's name on it. So just having a woman's name in play introduces negative bias. So when we talk about positive discrimination, it's not to unfairly advantage a woman candidate or a black candidate. The goal is to try at least to hold the pro-white male bias in abeyance, so that people have to look at the qualifications of the women candidate or the candidates of color. So I actually believe in positive discrimination as a creative strategy to try to address the serious underrepresentation of women in all professional positions and positions of power. I don't believe that white men are discriminated against if, in a case where two very qualified candidates, the job goes to the woman. There are so many pro-men biases that those men will do just fine. The other thing that I would note is that there was a little period in the US, a few short years, when affirmative action was allowed before it got outlawed. And during that period, whenever a man did not get a job, his instant retort was, I was discriminated against. So the woman who got hired could have a 100% average, and the guy could have a 70-degree average, and he would claim she got hired because of reverse discrimination, because they have no reality principle. So the whole politics of these gender situations are so complicated. So no, I don't think equal treatment is enough. I think that we really need all the wisdom that feminist studies has given us to begin to parse how racial and gender power circulates in very particular contexts, to think about what is required to help people have a fair chance. And fair chance is different than equal treatment. If you have, I'll give an example from my own university. We had created at Rutgers several different kinds of women's leadership programs, particularly to give our women students mentoring on how to move ahead, because they don't get mentored in the workforce. When you take a young woman and you plop her into a professional workforce, rather than being mentored by a senior male, she's more likely to be sexually harassed by a senior male. So if you want to empower women students to protect themselves and to figure out how to move through these enormously complicated power situations, leadership training can be a really good thing. Our last president of the university decided that leadership programs for women were discriminatory because they were only for women, not for men. Indicate the men talk more than the women, The male's very presence can intimidate women from talking about certain kinds of things. So a program designed to give women a fair chance gets reinterpreted as discriminatory, and the next thing you know, the program doesn't exist in the same way, because once it's gender inclusive, it's a whole different program. So I think, until we reach a world where there's far more equality than there is now, we have to have special programs to try to enhance the capacities of those who have histories of marginalization and exclusion. And in deciding who has a history of marginalization and exclusion, I don't mean we have to be naive. So a woman who comes from an incredibly affluent family whose parents have given her all kinds of advantages should not be seen as marginalized and excluded in the same way that a low-income person who has had, public schooling, no special opportunities, no money for travel. I mean, there are a lot of factors, class, ethnicity, race, religion, sexuality, that come into play. But I do think those who are marginalized and oppressed need more than just equal treatment. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, just because I feel like these special opportunities given to women in order to empower them they might become reasons for self-segregation of women. They are enclosed in special programs, and still, even the fact that you yourself associated gender-friendly policies in the parliament with the need of taking care, preparing meals and looking after children. I feel it's kind of self-segregation of women and a kind of perpetuation of gender inequality, first of all. And it's, according to me, it is also demonstrated by the fact that feminist studies and gender studies are attended, classes are attended mostly by women. And
not in the United States, where we have lots of years of gender studies. We have lots of men in our gender studies classes.
okay.
But I take your point. Malcolm X, a very famous black nationalist in the United States, once drew a hard and fast distinction between segregation and separation. And he defined segregation as a system that excludes, whereas separation, for strategic purposes, in order to figure out how to move forward, he said, is not the same phenomenon at all. The power dynamics are different. And I think that you're right. There have always been women's organizations that were women only. I'm not advocating a world in which there are women in these organizations and men in those organizations. What I'm talking about is certain kinds of educational opportunities, training opportunities, apprenticeship opportunities that give women a chance to get in the door. But once they're in the door, they have to fight for every inch they're going to have. So there are huge debates about single-sex education versus co-ed education. And this, it's wonderful to talk about evidence-based research. The evidence is completely messed up. Nobody has a clue which is actually better for kids. So there's no way to take an absolute position on one or the other. But the goal long-term is to empower those who have been forcibly excluded so that they can contest. They have the courage to contest. They've got the strategy to figure out ways around blockades. Because if they think they're going to be treated exactly the same, they're deluding themselves. One of the I'm not a feminist but approaches to life that is so popular among young women in lots of different countries, including the US, they claim they've never been discriminated against, there's no pay inequity anymore, there just aren't these problems. These were the problems of their mother's generation. And they say that until they get a job. And then in the workforce, they are appalled at the abysmal treatment to which they're subjected. So, my view is every woman's a proto-feminist. She just needs to all of a sudden get thrown into the lion's den, and then she'll see why you have to have certain kinds of solidarity and separate spaces to save your sanity. At Rutgers, we have, it's called the Institute for Women's Leadership, and it's the head of 9 different research centers. Center for American Women in Politics, Center for Women's Global Leadership, Center for Women in Work, Institute for Women in Art, Center for Violence Against Women and Children, and I'm forgetting the rest of them. They get together once a month to strategize, because even though our university is known for gender studies, we are constantly facing so much entrenched opposition that would wipe us out like that. So if we didn't strategize collectively, any one of us could be picked off. So when the university says they're going to close the Institute for Women in Art, we get together and think about, okay, what can we do collectively to support this unit, to get it new resources, to improve its reputation, to enhance people's understanding of the project. Those kinds of spaces of strategy, I think, are just absolutely crucial. Until we get to an equal world. Maybe then. I'd die happy if we got halfway there.
Yeah, I'm still confused about public-private because when you were talking about the case, how state enters into the...
Actually, it's not, yeah, I know what you're asking. It's interesting for
When state enters into the private sphere, and you were describing it does not depend on liberal or authoritarian governments, how they still govern individual bodies, and how, like, as focused as social bodies in making, and how they construct it and present it as natural and normal, and the ways bodies subjected to this norm. But, so if we, and you problematize this, like it's a biopolitics which is problematized. But on the other hand, like, then how we can justify when feminists, for instance, like, on the other hand, we have this Habermasian criticism of public sphere when feminists were criticizing that this is a sphere where issues, women's issues are not represented and discussed because they are considered to be private. And so when they're given value, they're brought up into the public sphere. So, and women want to their issues to be discussed, like how then we can demand about the marital rape to be recognized, with domestic violence, be that, or all this. So this dichotomy between biopolitics and what is private, and how we can justify our demands to be taken into account seriously.
Right. In talking, kind of unmasking liberal democratic claims about the nature of the polity, feminists just want to help people to see that the boundaries between public and private is nowhere near what liberal theorists have led us to believe. That doesn't mean that privacy isn't an important value that we might want to fight for. In fact, most feminists think we need more privacy to make decisions about our own bodies and all kinds of intimate decisions. But we also think that the public sphere has to remain a space of politicization. And that's part of the work of social justice activists, to figure out what are the issues that are most in need of politicization. And by that I mean to make them subjects of collective concern. So I do think all kinds of private issues require the public to care about them. And part of the problem is that the way that power circulates, some people's concerns are taken as public concerns, but not everyone's. So this act of politicization, what are we going to make a matter of public concern, and how? And how are we going to suggest public policies that will respect individual privacy, but not in ways that just encode inequalities as natural, is all up for grabs. So I guess I would say that what feminist analysis helps us to see is there's no hard and fast line. Exactly what's private, what's public, what needs to be protected as a private issue, what needs to be politicized, as a social justice question, all of that's up for grabs. Whereas lots of political science says, well, we define a public issue in terms of what affects X number of people. So if it affects 60% of the people, then it's a public issue. Well, women are only 52% of the population, so nothing affecting women is a public issue. So it just wants to change those terms of debate. But it certainly doesn't suggest that there aren't many contexts in which we want to preserve privacy, or that we want to embrace the importance of public activism. And that's a whole nother fight that has gone on within feminist activism, whether women should get involved in the public sphere when the public sphere is corrupt, abusive, harrowing, and I mean, I come down on the side that we need courageous women on all fronts. There are just so many issues that require attention. We have to have women, even when it's a grueling position to, break new ground and to have to become the object of that much hostility in order to make some gains.
Can I ask about the difference of state again, but about the example of banning headscarves as a tool? Can't it be justified as well as protecting women from religious restrictions, for example?
But the women who are quote being protected are absolutely articulate that they are not being forced to wear the headscarf, that this is a matter of their own quote private religious commitments, that they are not a threat to public institutions, and that they are not themselves proselytizing. Devout Muslim women, some, not all, choose to wear a headscarf or an abaya. I mean, there are different kinds of veiling practices. But if the women are, and there's a wonderful organization, Women Living Under Muslim Law, which exists in 60 different countries, and it's feminist activists who happen to be Islamic, and they are absolutely clear that the choice to veil or not to veil should be the decision of a particular woman. It should not be encoded in law. So for some Western states to think that they are protecting young Muslim girls by banning them from schools because they can't go to school, they won't go to school without what they consider their proper modest attire, how does that protect them from anything? To deny them an education? So I don't accept the protectionist language when it's Western liberal governments using a kind of Orientalist discourse to position themselves as fighters for women at the same time that the women don't have anything like equality in their own country. So I see it far more as an ideological manipulation than as anything even remotely helpful to the Muslim women involved. Maya, were you gonna?
My question was about, it's more of like modern, I'd say, not like scholarly literature, but we see now this modern trend in pop feminist literature, which says that, and you have also mentioned like examples that yes, men talk more in classrooms than women, and there are also like endless row of patterns observed that women do certain things in a different way rather than men do. For example, women may consider that they need more qualification to apply for a certain job, or they are not that much talking out loud, or they are, obeying all the rules and regulations when men just don't care about certain institutional standards, etc. And that's why that is also something that supports men to succeed when women and lags women behind. And also you have mentioned the education, which is controversial, but I have also seen some data demonstrating that single single-sex colleges, like female colleges, women may achieve more because they are brought up in truly gender-neutral environment, which also suggests that at some cases, instead of inequalities to be corrected by law, there could be also concern not to create inequalities in the first place. And also, if you consider the difficulties like regulation constraint, especially in developing countries where institutions are far less than perfect, do you believe that education can be more effective ways to address inequalities rather than laws positively discriminating women?
I guess I would say I wouldn't pit them against each other. And going back to the 19th century, education is the liberal solution for everything. So any liberal theorist that you can read, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, everybody said the solution to all inequality is education. This is, John Stuart Mill, who also said there should be a means test for marriage, so that if you weren't rich enough, you wouldn't be allowed to have children. Like, oh yes. Liberals are remarkably insensitive to structural barriers. Barriers rooted in class, gender, race, ethnicity. So the same-sex educational schools, and this goes for elementary schools, high schools, colleges, I would say are not neutral environments, they're pro-women environments. And it's that pro-woman edge that gives them an incentive. If we look at U.S. experience, the school segregation that was entrenched by law did not affirm African Americans' learning experiences at all because the schools were so poorly funded. They didn't have adequate textbooks, they didn't have adequate teachers, they didn't have adequate physical facilities. So it's not just a separate space, but it's what goes on in that space. And there certainly are educational programs designed to give a leg up to students of color or to girls, and they can be enormously powerful. But not everybody likes them. Some little girls hate all-girl environments. From the States, the data suggests that from preschool through 6th grade, co-ed education is perfectly fine. Little girls are assertive, they're curious, they speak out, they do well in math, science, English, all the topics. In fact, the girls outperform the boys in every single subject. The minute puberty hits, it's like a bomb. But that doesn't mean all girls want to go into all-girl schools. I mean, a lot of them want the flirtation, they want the excitement, they want that, little buzz from, having boys' attention. So I don't think education alone can do it. I think we need certain kinds of structural change. I mean, the one thing that we know transnationally, the factor that has made the hugest change in the percentages of women in elective office is the introduction of quotas. It's now called the fast track to women's equality. But having a quota system in and of itself does not guarantee that you get system change, because political parties often choose which women they're going to put on the party ticket. And who do they choose? They choose women they think they can manage. So part of what we learn is that everything we try isn't quite enough. It gets us this far, but then we still need more. And so I'm absolutely poly approach. You got to try lots and lots of different things. Many countries will never ever move towards positive discrimination. They just won't do it. So in those contexts, what can you work out? What can you sort out? What kinds of strategies can you come up with? And some women, just need the solidarity of other women. Some women are like high flyers on their own. They don't want to be encumbered with other women. Some women actively identify with a responsibility to represent, quote, women's interests, whatever that may be. That's another huge question. Others, like, I'm on my way up, I'm going to be the president, I don't want to get derailed by being associated with women's issues. So there are just so many different parameters. It's like we need every single strategy we can get. But I wish that education alone would do it, but it doesn't always work.
Well, I don't mean exactly always same-sex education. I meant that maybe like creating more equal play for girls to succeed maybe higher. But anyway, it was interesting for me to see that I totally didn't expect, I totally, honestly, I totally didn't expect that this may have some sense.
And one other factor that does also enter in, it's off in co-ed circumstances with teachers who are really dedicated to try to break down gender stereotypes. It's often easier to get girls involved in athletics and sports and what have been traditionally boys' activities than to get boys to do any of the cooking. So I absolutely acknowledge to say that, well, you know, somebody's got to put the kids to bed and feed them is a sexist thing to say. But all the evidence we have from every country in the world is that if you just assume the dads are going to do it, the kids will not be fed and they'll be up all night. So you know, there are these, you know, kind of constraints for women who choose to have kids, and this also gets into it. There have been some interesting studies of women who, before they have kids, they and their husbands say, oh, we are going to have a completely egalitarian marriage. We're going to divide all labor, cleaning, cooking, shopping, total equality. And when they're just two adults, it sort of works because they decide they don't want to clean, the house stays dirty. It's usually the woman who gets zero tolerance for dirt before the man does, so not quite equal. They really need to, they go out to eat or get carry-out food or something. But when you have kids, and there's, it even happens when you have pets, when there has to be something cared for, a child, a dog, a cat, something fed, something that requires a routine, something that requires that no matter how much pressure is at your job, somebody gets home to do it. It's usually the woman. I mean, all those promises of sheer equality. And the way that many professional women in affluent countries deal with this is by hiring a nanny, live-in help. So if they say, no, I am not going to leave my job because I am absolutely dedicated to my profession, they can't count on their husbands doing it. So the family hires support staff. But if something happens, it's the support staff's day off. The crisis, if the child gets sick, the mom will get called, not the dad. So I agree. It's a remnant of this unfair ancient order. So I would welcome your suggestions for how to get rid of that, because it is a tough
I
one.
really, without hope for the situation in my country concerning gender bias, and I actually don't know whether it is the political realm that has produced societal inequality, or on the other side, or rather it is the societal inequality that is perpetuated on a political level.
Both. I mean, you've got both. I mean, the whole system is structured to advantage men. So, I mean, there's not a perfect egalitarian society that got warped by politics, and there's not a, you know, such an evil society that a political avenger came in and sorted it out. You got it going in all directions. But the good thing is that we have now feminist scholars working in all of these fields: politics, economics, sociology, psychology, natural sciences, and so We're beginning to get new ideas all the time about things that can be tried, experimented with. And there's also that old hope that men will get tired of the rat race and think about some creative solutions too.
If there is no,
The issue of scarves in France, can we get back to that? Okay, if children send girls with scarves to school, what about in public places? Are there any sanctions against them for showing up in public places?
Public defined as, like, not a movie theater. They could go to a movie theater, it wouldn't be an issue. But schools, government buildings, public squares, France's ban is pretty extensive, yes. Incredibly extensive.
If they show up, there's fine or something like that?
If they go to school, they're not allowed in. If they go to a government office, they're not allowed. I mean, literally, their guards won't let them in. It's the draconian aspect of excluding them from. So you couldn't go to get a marriage certificate at a town hall wearing a headscarf. So if you're planning to get married and you can't get in there to sign the paperwork, it's like, so it's pretty draconian. And I don't know about showing up in public squares if they'd actually do anything to you, but yeah.
There's no guard. It's kind of discrimination, isn't it?
It is discrimination.
I just wanted to ask, when you were talking to Nani and mentioning about quotas, and so one of the reasons can be, of course, that a reservation will help to represent women's interests. And for this reason, if we have women who are easily manageable and who carry patriarchal ideas, it is disruptive of this idea. But on the other hand, the reason can be simply, can't it be that we need just equal representations in terms of numbers? Because if half of the world are women, so we need just numbers, be it patriarchal or whatever, but numbers should be equal.
Oh no, I actually am a fervent proponent of quotas. But again, every time there's an empirical study, we learn something that we didn't know. So the Parité campaign in France, France actually passed a constitutional amendment requiring that every political party nominate 50% of its candidates women. Constitution. And then the next year they passed implementing legislation. So you would think, this was done, 1999 was the constitutional amendment, 2000 was the implementing legislation. So you would think, as of the first election, after 2000, there should have been 50% women in the French National Assembly. You know how much there was? 18%. So it's like, whoa, how can you have a constitutional mandate and still produce such a pitiful result? Well, the implementing legislation said any political party that doesn't want to comply with the constitutional requirement will just have to pay a fine. And the fine was set so low that the political party said, sure, we'll pay a fine. Not a problem. So women have made more headway at the town level. There are now almost 50% women mayors in France, so they're making headway at the town, village level. But at the National Assembly, it's still, I think it's up to maybe 27% now, 13 years later. And women have to fight for every single inch. But still, it's a strategy. It's an important strategy because in some countries, women have made huge gains that way. So, yep, try everything. That's what I mean. Okay, well, thank you all. Oh, sorry.
So I have a quick question. So we're talking about the quotas and implementing the gender equality policies in actual life. And if we took countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, so there are some legislation that, I would say, make men also to participate in the family life. So for example, the example what you have put from the Supreme Court in the United States, so it won't go at any case in countries Norway, Sweden, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, definitely. So my question would be, is there any, how to say, can we somehow justify coming of the other variables like culture, religious affiliation or whatever, even though I'm talking about the very vague terms, but it seems to me, I even didn't know that Sweden implemented quota principle afterwards when they got quite a big number of the women representation. I thought that it was the quota, but no, it was that they managed to do that, but still they put. And on Monday they were even talking that we haven't achieved our real goal. So my question is, what are the, if there are any literature, and if I can find, what are the variables or the cultural dimensions that are somehow influence the gender equality policy to be implemented?
Yeah, one of the most important is the Socialist Party in the country that has an official commitment to equality. If you look at the Nordic states, there was both that history of social democracy with espousing a value of equality. There was, and mostly it's much easier in smaller nations that have a history, and this is one of these quirky variables. Eileen McDonough is a political scientist who has studied 4,000 years of women in political office, and she claims nations that have a history of having a queen at any point in their past literally shape the values of the nation differently than systems that have only had male power. Now, I'm not sure that I find her evidence totally compelling, but she actually talks about a history of, quote, the maternal state, a state that articulates a stance of caring about the citizens as opposed to rights-bearing citizens. So where welfare is a value